Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? It's probably the closest I'm going to get to being a rock star, having this microphone and the music. It's really nice. But then I start talking about budgeting, and that's not really a rock star moment. But thank you very much for the kind invitation to this very interesting conference today. Of course, the matter stays close to all of our hearts, performance budgeting. My name is Álfrún Tryggvadóttir, really good pronunciation of my name there. I'm working as a policy analyst at the OECD. I've been working before that at the Ministry of Finance in Iceland as the Deputy Budget Director, closely involved with implementation of performance budgeting there and the implementation of spending reviews. So today I'm going to talk about this, the big picture, and look at some key findings from this publication that I assume that you all have read thoroughly, Budgeting and Public Expenditure in the OECD Countries 2019, and compare a bit where Estonia stands in relation to, relative to other OECD countries in terms of performance budgeting and other practices. So just quickly, first, yes, this works, really good. On the, I'm going to leave this here. Quickly about the economic context. Like you all know, Estonia has performed relatively well following the economic crisis, and you can look at the trend there. But after exceeding around 4% in 2017, economic growth in Estonia is projected to decline to around 3% in 2019. Public and private investment should recover from past low levels, and high wage growth will sustain private consumption, and export growth will remain strong. So that's kind of the overall trend. And just a bit about the fiscal policy plans. Counter-cyclical or neutral fiscal policy is the main fiscal policy direction within the country. And the medium-term objective of the government is that the general government structural deficit will not exceed around 0.5% of GDP. And this reflects both policy and budgetary choices within the country. And you can see here that, or it's not really clear, but it's supposed to be very clear, the trends there on the other picture, but it should be stated there that the public investment in Estonia is above the OECD average, both as a percentage of overall government expenditure and relative to GDP. And also, general government expenditure in Estonia just below the OECD average. You can see it there, but relatively lower compared to other Eurozone countries. And then back to the publication I mentioned. You can see here the 10 OECD principles of modern budgeting, as they are called. And they provide, these principles 10, they provide a solid framework to assess countries' efforts within this field. And it's really important, although each of them are really solid and good components, it's really important also to look at how they're linked together, how they relate. And for this session, I think I'm going to use the pointer. I'm mostly going to focus on these four here. Alignment with medium-term strategic plans and priorities. I'm going to look at performance evaluation and value for money. And transparency, openness, and accessibility, which is, of course, really important to Estonia. And participated, inclusive, and realistic debate. So that's kind of the 4 points I will be focusing on for this session. So we can ask the question, why is budgetary governance important at all? Why is the OECD, for example, doing publications like the one I mentioned earlier? Why are we looking at this at all? And we all know who sit in this room here that the budget document, it's a political document, and it of course sets out the government priorities across all areas. And as such, the budget process tries to achieve some coherence across different, and I think in many cases, conflicting objectives. It also has very many stakeholders, like we know. It has the ministries, parliament, citizens, agencies, and more. And for that reason, the budgetary governance goes beyond the budget documents that are usually prepared in most countries by the Ministry of Finance. And we have to also look at the relationship between all of the actors within this process. So it's important to look at how the budget process can integrate both immediate fiscal objectives and also how we can look to the longer-term objectives. It's important to look at how this process can align with and inform overall strategic goals of the government, how it can provide guidance and informed dialogue with line ministries and agencies as well, how it can inform, consult with, and be transparent and accountable to key stakeholders such as the Parliament and citizens, which are really, of course, very different stakeholders, but both really important. And then manage the entire budget cycle to ensure independent forecasts and estimates, implementation of budget decision, and financial reporting. So just to mention some aspects there. But now on to the more interesting stuff, I would say, after this brief introduction. Just the key findings from the publication I mentioned earlier, and how Estonia stands. This is the outline of the report. I'm not going to read it off the slide, you can see it there, but in the end of the report there is a comparison between, and we have country profiles there. So there you can see how Estonia, if you decide to read this interesting publication, you can see where Estonia stands compared to other countries. But I just produced some slides that I thought were relevant and interesting for you all in this audience to see. And of course, please ask some good and critical questions afterwards. So for the first slide, I'm going to look at how budgetary governance priorities are. And the question behind this slide is, have there been any significant budgetary reforms since the end of 2014? And what have been the main areas of interest or reforms within different OECD countries? And what I did for Estonia is that they have the blue outline. So you can see there that Estonia, indeed, like we all know, there have been many reforms within Estonia in this time. And the focus in Estonia has been, of course, on fiscal rules, like with many other countries, and on the implementation and further strengthening the performance budgeting framework, and of course, of the implementation of spending reviews as well. And in general, among OECD countries, there are well-established frameworks, but it's really important to note, although the frameworks are in general very well established, we have to always keep an eye on, improving the process and improving this, because it's a continuous implementation phase, I think. We're not there yet. No country, maybe Denmark, but, not many other. So on to the next slide. So for this slide, countries were asked to identify if there is a performance budgeting framework in place. And of course, for Estonia, you can see that there is indeed a performance framework in place. And Estonia is identified there among 3 countries. You can see there in 2018. It's optional for both line ministries and agencies. And this is, of course, what's stated in the legal framework from 2014. And this answer of Estonia, of course, reflects the transition time to performance-based budgeting in 2020. So overall, within OECD countries, use of performance information continues to increase across all countries. And it's interesting that here countries noted that the main challenge is the quality and availability of performance information. I think this applies to all countries. I mean, this is really where we need to keep on focus on keep an eye on this field, because this is always the tricky part. And also interesting, because now Estonia is in the midst of implementing spending reviews, or strengthening also the framework of spending reviews. The results of spending reviews are increasingly being used during budget negotiation within OECD countries. And I'm going to dig a bit deeper into that later on in the presentation. So now about an area which I guess is really interesting to you in Estonia, information on citizens' guides and open data. Countries were asked here to indicate what kinds of budget data or guides are published in addition to the budget-related documents. And you can see here that Estonia has an open data for the approved budget and the year-end financial statements. And in general, among OECD countries, in Estonia as in other countries, the principle of budget transparency is well established. But I think the most important here, just from my perspective, is not only that we publish this information, but how do we publish it? I mean, you can publish all kinds of information, but for whom is it, and in what form is it, and who is really the end user? I mean, we can have examples of countries who produce a budget with 50,000 line items or something, and they call themselves really transparent, but who can really read the budget documents? Probably not Parliament, probably not citizens. So that's kind of what we also have to think about. And in terms of when you think about, I mean, it's a fine line, because sometimes you produce too much, and then sometimes you produce too little, so you have to find, somewhere in between there. So yeah, for me at least, that's the interesting part for this answer. And just quickly about the medium-term expenditure framework. As you can see from this slide, this framework is commonly used among OECD countries. And here on this slide, we have data from 2007, 2012, and 2018, but obviously for Estonia, only for 12 and 18. And just quickly to explain the variables used for this index. It's the existence and legal basis for the medium-term expenditure framework. It's the length and substance of the ceilings, and also the quality and durability of the ceilings, and then the monitoring of the medium-term expenditure framework. And for Estonia, the key findings for this slide were, it's of course set in law on a 4-year rolling basis. It can be revised more than once a year. Hopefully I'm not saying anything wrong here. It's monitored by the Fiscal Council, and it looks at the fiscal or economic forecast, structural balance, and of course the medium-term objective. Yeah. Then to dig a bit deeper into the reason why we're all here, performance-based budgeting and spending reviews, and finding some interesting results there for Estonia. First of all, this slide looks at the use of performance information over the last 5 years within OECD countries. The question was there, has it increased in terms of volume and usage? And you can see there that Estonia shows increase in all categories. The use has increased by program managers, by minister and senior civil servants, by Parliament, which I think is really good, and it's not the case in all countries, and by civil society and media. Of course, it's difficult sometimes to estimate this, but this is the finding. And again, what matters here for this slide, I think, and for the answers is it's not only the increased use of performance information, but how do you use it? I think we have to look at, and that's interesting what Pia mentioned earlier, is you have to use this information. It has to be produced so you can improve the decision making, I mean, at all levels of government. So I think that's kind of something that we also have to keep in mind. In many countries, I speak from an experience from a country who has an overflow of performance information, and no one knows what to do with all the information. Parliament does not do, and we don't know what to do in the Ministry of Finance. And so you also have to think about the quality and what you want to achieve by producing this information. And here on this slide, we can see the greatest or the top 5 benefits of performance budgeting. Here, countries were asked to identify where this had positive or negative changes within budgetary management areas. And you can see that Estonia has seen a substantial improvement for almost all the categories mentioned there. We have the transparency about program objectives, we have quality and usefulness of performance information, general performance awareness, achievement of program objectives, and effectiveness and efficient of budget implementation processes. So you can see there that Estonia shows substantial improvement in 4 categories, and then small improvement within the achievement of program objectives. And in general, countries identify the increased transparency and quality and usefulness of performance information as the greatest benefit, which is not surprising at all. But this, like I've mentioned probably several times during this presentation, is always an ongoing challenge within many countries. Okay. And this is a really interesting slide, I think. We see the main obstacles for implementation of performance budgeting. And what Estonia identifies here is lack of timely data, which I think is really relevant for the projects that Estonia is doing now, and lack of leadership or commitment. And that, I think, in general, I think that must be really an issue within many countries. But it would be really interesting to hear your views on that, if you agree with this as those being the main challenges during the questions. But you can see here that nearly all the categories show improvements between 2016 and 2018. The only field that scores like higher or lower is not showing improvements is that the focus of performance is not sustained. And I think that's something that we can all agree on is an ongoing challenge. It's really difficult with all the daily issues that come up to keep up the reform stamina, if you can call it that. I mean, people have enough to do, but then you have some extra. But it's really important that countries do it. This slide is relatively straightforward, I would say. It looks at who's responsible for target setting within countries and what this target setting covers. So you can see here for Estonia, line ministries and agencies and the Prime Minister's office are responsible for target setting. And Estonia sets targets for all programs. So I think I would say that's definitely a plus if the information is being used in a good way, definitely. But this is, of course, an ongoing involvement within Estonia. Also on this slide, we see the indicators of thematic or cross-cutting issues or objectives within the budget. And Estonia here indicated for all thematic objectives that they are limited to budget programs of the ministry or agency with lead responsibility. But as you can see from this slide, gender is one of the thematic objectives most likely to be systematically integrated into performance frameworks. I don't have the knowledge really of how Estonia is doing that now with gender budgeting, but I think also if you look at climate change there, it wouldn't be surprising if that would go up in the coming years, looking at the discussion that is going on now. So here we have some information of the Sustainable Development Goals. In most countries, they're generally not systematically reflected within the performance frameworks. That is the case for most OECD countries. For Estonia, it's interesting, Sustainable Development Goals are closely aligned, as you can see here from the first graph, closely aligned for sector-specific performance framework, and then I think it's really interesting, they are systematically reflected for national performance framework. And Estonia is there among 6 other countries, and Iceland is also there, so I think it's well done for us. But this is also, I think, something that could be, this could increase in many countries with time, I think, I assume that. Then on to the very interesting stuff, the spending reviews. That's, of course, an important topic now for Estonia. And here you can see the main results of spending reviews over the past 10 years. We have reallocation of spending to match government policy priorities. We have medium to long-term improvements in spending efficiency, spending cuts, just clear cuts. And that's kind of the quick and dirty way of doing it, like the Danes call it, leading to a rapid reduction in the budget. And then you have program elimination. And countries were there asked to identify if these objectives were met in full, substantially met, and largely unmet. Of course, it's always, I mean, it's up for interpretation, but this is, I think it's an interesting slide, nevertheless. Of course, spending reviews, yeah, you can see that they're an emerging tool for spending reallocation to match, yeah. And it's moving, spending reviews kind of are moving now away from just being this after the crisis with the implementation of spending reviews. They were just like, we need cuts, but now it's more like, you know, we're looking into more of an efficiency way of doing things. So yeah, in Estonia, this is a new process, so the indicated answer was they're not assessed for all areas, so we don't have any information on this for Estonia. But however, we have some information for Estonia here, and this is moving on to the main objective. We saw the results on the previous slides, but now we have the main objectives of spending reviews. We see similar results here as on the previous slide. The main objectives are improving spending efficiency over the medium term and realignment of spending with government priorities. And you can see there that for Estonia, the current objectives, if it still applies, it's probably changing. It's an evolving process. Operational improvements and realignment with government priorities as well. Yes, like I said, it's really interesting how the focus is moving away from the quick and dirty spending cuts to this, countries that just spending review are not being used in a single way now. You can use them as a tool for cutting spending. You can use them as, looking into some, if you need some information within a certain field, and then you can also just look at the efficiency. I mean, how efficient is the spending within each country? So it's a tool that you can use depending on the economic situation within countries, which makes it, I think, a really interesting tool to look at. Yeah, and then on to, you can see there that in 2011, only 16 countries were doing spending reviews, and now we have 27 in 2018, and then 3 have it as under consideration. New adopters in 2018 were Austria, of course Estonia, Hungary, and Norway. So it's becoming a really quite popular tool within many countries, and I think, like I said, because it's such a It's a menu now. You can use it for different purposes. It's a tool that is frequently used within many countries. So here we can see some information of the use of performance information during the budget negotiation. This is kind of how the discussion is between line ministries and the central budgeting authority. And it's interesting to see how countries, the politicians or civil servants, use this information for budget negotiation and what the trend is. And you can see that the information or results, not necessarily always the results, just also the information that you get from doing a spending review within a certain field is becoming more important within countries in terms of budget negotiation. So that's an evolving trend within the OECD. And Estonia ranking is in line with other OECD countries there. Operational data and performance reports, spending review information, and program evaluation, that's the information that's mostly used in this budget negotiation phase within Estonia. And here we can see the main challenges, the ranking for the main challenges for the implementation of the results of spending reviews. Estonia there rated inattention to implementation and lack of capacity, for example, available staff, as a high challenge. And you can see that the green box there, that's where most countries are located. But I think also the answer of Estonia, lack of capacity, available staff, is a huge challenge within many countries. It's like, you do it, and then people stop doing it. You have to keep it up, so you have to pay attention to the process as well. It's an ongoing process. It's not just an one-off exercise. So I think the issues that the Estonia raised are really interesting, and I can definitely relate to them coming from Iceland. That was a big challenge there. So, some observations for Estonia. What do we take away from this lecture here? I think, looking at this and the main findings, budget and administrative reforms, it's a long run. It's not a sprint. It requires determination. You have to be really determined. And I think we have seen so many cases within OECD countries where it starts. It's written into, even in many cases in some countries, you have it just written in legislation and then no one is doing it. It's just on paper. So it has to, I think Estonia has come a really long way compared to many other countries. And it's also a plus side. You have to use the kind of the smallness. It's good, like Pia also mentioned, and I can relate to that as well. Being a relatively small nation, I think you have to use that. It's always easier. You have more closeness between the key players, parliament, agencies, ministries, you kind of can keep up the discussion. But for my, just as I look at it, Estonia, well done. It's been you've done well so far. And like I said, important to maintain focus on implementation now that the performance-based budgeting has been introduced. For me, it's kind of like a marathon. You decide to do a marathon, and then you do the training, and then you just have to be really determined to finish the marathon. But if you're going to be the best, that I assume that Estonia is going to be, you have to really, keep on the training, and you have to do like really many runs. And that's just like, you have to keep your focus. You always have to keep one eye on the reforms. And just in terms of, in general, what we can take away from this results from other OECD countries, in general, performance budgeting has increased the transparency of program objectives and the quality and usefulness of performance information. That's a general observation that we can take from this findings in the publication. Also, this lack of accurate and timely data, it's a huge challenge. It's within all OECD countries, and that's kind of where we're always we're stuck there. And you have the technology; it's moving so fast. So how do you implement the right systems to face these ongoing challenges? Performance-based budgeting systems, they're increasingly being asked to look at like this horizontal, views, sustainable development goals. We have the gender budgeting, green budgeting, and everything, but we're just always, within our silos. We just, people are just looking at their own ministries and line items and programs. So that's kind of also how do we meet in this horizontal, vertical way? And also just to end this lecture of mine, the focus of spending reviews in OECD countries it's moving away from short-term budget cuts, like I discussed earlier, to improving medium-term efficiency, program impact, and alignment with government priorities. And like I mentioned, I think that's really the interesting part. You can use spending reviews in all kinds of ways, which is, it's not the evil tool of the Ministry of Finance that you just have to cut your budget anymore. You can just use it, and it's a mutual tool for the line ministries and the Ministry of Finance. So thank you very much. Hopefully you have some interesting questions.
Thank you, Álfrún. A lot of information.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it is very good book what you show.
Oh yeah, have you read it?
No, not yet, but I think it will be a bedtime storybook for kids.
Yes, definitely. Mine have read it several times.
So we have a few questions. One about this budget document. How to make the budget understandable for the citizens. Which countries are doing well? Do you have any good examples?
I think Estonia is doing quite well, isn't it?
There is always, every year, who can read it?
No, it's the same. But it's a really good question, because I think countries are moving away from having, like I mentioned, a really extreme example of 50,000 line items, but they're really moving away from having like lots of line items towards having much fewer line items. But then you hit the wall again. I guess you're referring to, Parliament complains about that they don't get the necessary information, but when they get too much information, they also complain about that. So it's kind of a fine line, and I think it's just something that all countries are struggling with. I think that Sweden, I think some countries have been looking towards Sweden. I think Estonia is doing like in being open and accessible, but it's like I said, I can't mention just one country, but it's an ongoing challenge within many countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's going much harder to understand it, because there are specific needs for more lines.
Definitely, and and it's also just if you would, I don't know if anyone actually reads all the budget documents, but if someone actually does it.
We can do an experiment.
Can you raise your hand if you read?
Last one person.
Yes, of course, you have several, but it's really when you do the budgeting process within the Ministry of Finance, you're like, people are going to read it and you have to have everything right, but then again, I don't know who really reads all of it, but I think in terms of you have to have it like, you have to try to have it a bit understandable, and that's a tricky challenge, it is. But, of course, Parliament is in the end responsible to taking the decisions, and they have to have, the right information. But I think it's maybe you shouldn't present all within the budget, but present more just like online and have it in an open data. And I think Finland, maybe Rika can, they've been doing quite well with that. Like we've at least been looking towards Finland, in terms of, you present something in the budget, but then you put some extra material for the parliamentarians online that they can access. Yeah.
So next question about open data movement and development. How you see what are the effects on budgeting? Any correlation?
Between the openness of data and good budget practices. Yeah, it kind of feeds into what I was just discussing. I think it's always difficult. I mean, I would say in general, if you put everything, and now I'm thinking like, but it's interesting because if you give the people who have to take the final decisions, the parliamentarians and citizens, of course, they have to have the information, put it all online. Of course, it should lead to a better and more open discussion. So I think there has to be a positive correlation between those estimates. But then again, I know that sometimes countries are using the trick. They're just putting everything online, and no one knows how to read, anything from it. And then you can just make the decision within some dark rooms within the Ministry of Finance. So I don't know. It's a tricky balance. But I would say that there must be some positive correlation between.
What is performance-based budget for the OECD?
What is it? It's a good question. It's just what I was trying to describe here. It's, if we're trying to link somehow performance and money. That's really in the simplest form. You have to, but then again, you can't link it too much, but you have to keep an eye on performance and you have to keep an eye on money. And if you see a line ministry or agency or someone who's constantly getting more money, but they're underperforming, at least that should give you some indication of either there's something wrong or they're just not, using the money in the right way. So I think that's kind of the correlation between, money and performance. Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for your presentation and answers.
Yes.
And
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.